The cry of a baby can shatter even the strongest heart. Because sometimes, the sound that breaks the silence outside is the same one echoing inside you. A cry for something you once lost and never got back. It started with that sound, raw, desperate, and piercing through the marble halls of a mansion that felt too large for one soul to bear. For 3 relentless hours, the infant's wail climbed the stairs, slipped through locked doors, and spilled into every forgotten corner of the Carter estate. To most, it was noise. To her, it was a blade. Downstairs, Isabella Torres's hands trembled around a damp rag as she scrubbed the same spotless patch of floor again and again. The scent of polish stung her eyes, but not as much as the ache behind them. 24, soft-spoken, and hollowed by grief, she had come to this house to survive, not to live. Yet each time that fragile cry echoed from the nursery above, something inside her shattered again. 6 weeks ago, she had buried her newborn son, a baby who never got to open his eyes to the world. 6 weeks ago, her body had still believed he was alive. It remembered, even when she tried to forget. Her breasts ached each dawn with milk that had nowhere to go, an unspoken cruelty of nature. And now, as she listened to another child's hunger echoing through these golden halls, she felt both punished and called. She whispered to herself, "He'll exhaust himself crying like that." Though her words dissolved into the empty air, her chest tightened, her pulse quickened. Grief had a sound, and tonight it was that baby's voice. Upstairs, little Ethan Carter, 2 months old, lay red-faced in a silk crib, lips cracked, skin feverish, gasping for the only thing that could soothe him. Beside him sat a bottle of spoiled milk, sour and useless. His nanny, hired from one of the city's most expensive agencies, had left hours earlier, promising to return with new formula. She hadn't. In the office below, Daniel Carter, Ethan's father, widowed and weary, tried to drown the cries in the hum of business calls and glowing screens. He had lost his wife, Claire, the day Ethan was born, and since then, no sound could pierce him more deeply than his child's cry. But duty and guilt made strange companions, and he had convinced himself that wealth could fix what was broken inside his home. Isabella tried to keep scrubbing, but every minute felt heavier. The cry climbed higher, ragged and weak. She dropped the cloth. Her knees wobbled. "Dear God," she breathed, "don't let that baby die." Her feet moved before her thoughts could catch them. Up the stairs, through the dark hallway lined with framed photos of a family that no longer existed. Her trembling hand turned the nursery door handle. The air hit her like fire. The baby lay still, face flushed with heat, his tiny mouth open, gasping for air, his body limp. The spoiled bottle sat on the table like a cruel joke. She didn't think, she remembered, the desperate nights she had held her own dying child, praying for milk to save him. The ache returned, fierce and primal. Instinct overcame fear. She gathered Ethan in her arms, pressing him to her chest. His skin burned, his breathing was shallow, and every second felt like a countdown. Tears blurred her sight. She unbuttoned her blouse with trembling fingers. Her body, still bound by memory, still a mother's body, responded like it had been waiting for this moment. When Ethan latched on, the crying stopped. The sound that had filled the mansion for hours melted into the gentle rhythm of breathing and swallowing. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Isabella's tears fell on his tiny forehead. "It's okay now, little one," she whispered. "You're safe." Her voice trembled, soft as prayer. For the first time since her son's death, she felt a heartbeat against her chest that wasn't her own, warm, alive, forgiving. Outside, the world continued. The rain tapping against tall windows, the ticking of an old clock echoing in rhythm with Ethan's breathing. Inside that quiet nursery, something unseen shifted. 2 broken souls. One too young to understand loss, one too scarred to accept hope, found each other in a way neither expected nor the world would ever understand. Time slipped away. The baby slept. Isabella sat motionless, afraid that if she moved, peace would vanish. She should have left, buttoned her blouse, gone back to her place downstairs. But she couldn't, because for the first time in weeks, the ache in her heart wasn't only pain. It was purpose. Then the door opened. Daniel stood there, framed in the golden light of sunset, his shirt sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow from work and grief. What he saw stopped him cold. His son in the arms of a maid, pressed close to her bare skin. For a long moment, no one breathed. The world shrank into that one image. A fragile woman, a starving child, and a man frozen between outrage and awe. Isabella jolted, clutching Ethan closer. "Sir, I can explain." But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind was chaos. His first instinct screamed wrong, inappropriate, unforgivable. Yet the part of him that was still a father saw something else. Peace. His son's face, once purple with tears, now soft and still. The silence between them was almost unbearable. Daniel's voice finally broke through, low and shaking. "What are you doing?" Isabella lowered her eyes, tears dripping onto Ethan's blanket. "He was burning up. The milk was spoiled. I had no choice. Please, he needed me." Daniel wanted to speak, to shout, but his words dissolved. He stared at the sleeping child, the one who hadn't stopped crying for days, and for the first time in weeks, the mansion was quiet. Something in his chest cracked open, but pride was a cruel guard. He stepped back, muttering, "You crossed a line," and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Isabella sat frozen, her heart pounding in her throat. Shame flooded her cheeks, but beneath it was something deeper. The echo of that tiny heartbeat still pressed to her skin. She knew what she'd done could cost her everything. Yet if she had to choose again, she would. Downstairs, Daniel poured himself a drink, staring at his reflection in the glass. He didn't understand the storm inside him. Anger tangled with gratitude, fear laced with something disturbingly close to admiration. He had seen countless women in his life, but none who looked like that, tears falling as she held life itself in her arms. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he opened that nursery door, nothing about his life would ever be the same. That night, as Isabella sat by the window, the sleeping child still in her arms, she looked out at the city lights glittering like distant stars. For the first time since she'd buried her baby, she whispered a prayer not for herself, but for this fragile little soul who had reminded her what it meant to be alive. Maybe this was how healing began, not with forgetting, but with finding someone to hold through the darkness. And as Ethan's tiny hand curled around her finger, she smiled through her tears. Because sometimes the people we're meant to save are the ones who save us instead. If this story touched a quiet place in your heart, the one that still aches, still hopes, still believes in love's second chances, stay with it. Let it remind you that no heartbreak is wasted, no kindness unseen. Leave your thoughts below, share what part of the story felt like your own, and subscribe if you wish to keep walking through stories that heal, one heartbeat at a time. Because somewhere, in another chapter, love is still waiting softly, patiently, for you too. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the sheer curtains of the Carter mansion, turning the room golden and quiet. Isabella stood by the window, holding the empty bottle that had spoiled the night before. Her fingers trembled as she rinsed it under the running tap. Every touch of water reminded her of the baby's weight against her chest, the fragile warmth that had slept against her heart. She didn't know what would happen now. The moment Daniel's eyes met hers last night had burned into her mind like fire. The mix of confusion and unspoken accusation still haunted her. Every second since then, she had felt the invisible line she crossed, not of shame, but of something she couldn't name. A moment when the world judged, yet her heart refused to feel regret. In the kitchen, the smell of coffee drifted faintly. The mansion felt strangely alive again, though no one spoke. The maids avoided her eyes, whispering in corners. Isabella could sense it, the storm that was coming. Yet she moved silently, tidying, folding, her body still tender from yesterday's emotions. Healing never came in loud ways. It came in quiet breaths, small acts, trembling hands that kept moving even when the heart hurt. Upstairs, Daniel hadn't slept. His face was pale, his eyes dark. He had spent the entire night watching his son breathe, remembering that tiny, peaceful expression as Ethan slept in Isabella's arms. The image wouldn't leave him. It lived behind his eyelids, haunting and strangely comforting. He didn't know whether to feel furious or grateful. Maybe both. Maybe neither. He sat in the nursery chair at dawn, tracing the frame of his late wife's photo. "Claire," he whispered, voice cracked. "What would you have done?" There was no answer, only the soft breathing of the child who had stopped crying the moment another woman had held him. The thought tore something inside him. He wanted to hate Isabella for it, but he couldn't, because deep down, he knew she had saved his son. By noon, the house began to stir. Melissa, the nanny who had abandoned her duty, returned. Her perfume entered before she did, a trail of false sweetness. She carried shopping bags, smiling nervously as she stepped inside. Isabella didn't look at her, but she could feel the woman's gaze. Sharp, judging, threatened. Daniel called Melissa into his office. Isabella heard muffled voices through the half-open door. The tones rose, then softened, then rose again. When Melissa emerged, her eyes darted toward Isabella with an expression that mixed guilt and something darker. Fear disguised as pride. That afternoon, as Isabella folded sheets in the laundry room, 2 other maids leaned by the doorway, whispering. Their words were like blades wrapped in silk. "They say she fed the baby herself. With her own." The other gasped. "That's not right. It's indecent. She lost her own child. Maybe she went mad." The first one murmured. Isabella froze. Her fingers tightened around the white fabric. The air in the room thickened, pressing against her chest. She wanted to shout that it wasn't madness. It was mercy. It was love. But she said nothing. The world rarely listened to women like her. She carried the clean sheets upstairs, her head bowed. Every step felt heavier, the walls of the mansion whispering her name with judgment. By the time she reached the nursery, she could hear Ethan's soft breaths again. He was sleeping peacefully, cheeks rosy, tiny fists curled beside his face. Her heart softened at the sight. "Thank God," she whispered. She set the sheets down quietly and stood there for a long while, just watching him breathe. The baby she had once soothed with her body's warmth now slept untouched by sorrow. It was enough, or so she told herself. The door opened behind her. Daniel stood there, his suit jacket hanging from one shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he said quietly. She turned, her pulse quickening. "Yes, sir?" He hesitated. "You should take the afternoon off. You've been through enough." His voice faltered on the last word. She wanted to ask if that meant he understood, or if it meant he wanted her gone. But instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you." When she left the mansion that afternoon, the sky was gray, heavy with unfallen rain. She walked without direction, her steps slow. She passed a small chapel on the corner, its door slightly open, and slipped inside. The faint scent of incense filled the air. She knelt in the last pew, pressing her trembling hands together. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know if what I did was wrong. I only know he would have died if I hadn't." Her voice broke. "Please, forgive me if mercy looks like sin in the eyes of men." The quiet answered her with soft light through stained glass. For a moment, peace brushed against her heart. Healing didn't erase the wound. It simply taught it to breathe without bleeding. When she returned to the mansion that evening, the air had changed. Whispers had spread faster than she could walk. The cook looked away. The gardener stopped greeting her. Even the old driver, who once smiled kindly, now averted his gaze. She knew. The rumor had escaped the house. At dinner, Daniel barely touched his food. Melissa spoke sweetly, pretending concern for Ethan, but her eyes glimmered with triumph. "It's just such a sensitive matter, sir," she murmured. "People talk. They say strange things." Daniel's fork froze midway. "What things?" Melissa lowered her gaze, her voice dripping with false pity. "That the maid, Isabella, did something inappropriate. You must be careful." could affect your reputation. The words hung in the air like poison. That night, Daniel paced his office, the city lights flickering beyond the tall windows. He thought of the whispers, the judgment, the fragile line between decency and compassion. The world didn't care about truth. It cared about appearances. He closed his eyes and saw Isabella again, her trembling hands, her tears falling onto his child's face. Something inside him twisted painfully. The next morning, he called her into his office. She stood in the doorway, small, pale, her hands clasped tightly before her. He didn't meet her eyes. "Isabella," he said, voice low, steady but strained. "I appreciate everything you've done, but it would be best if you didn't come back tomorrow." Her breath caught. "Sir, please, I didn't mean any harm. The baby." "I know," he interrupted, his tone breaking for just a second. "But this situation has become complicated. I can't risk it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she bowed her head. "I understand." She wanted to say goodbye to Ethan, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned and left quietly, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Outside, the rain finally fell, slow, cold, cleansing. She stepped into it without an umbrella, letting it soak through her hair and clothes. Each drop felt like a small absolution, a whisper that maybe someday someone would understand. Daniel watched her from the window, his chest tightening. He told himself it was the right decision, to protect his son, his name, his fragile world. Yet as he saw her figure disappear beyond the gate, something inside him fractured in silence. That night, the mansion returned to its cold rhythm. But the peace was a lie. Ethan began to cry again, a deep, hollow wail that clawed through the air like grief itself. Melissa tried the bottle. He refused. She rocked him. He screamed louder. Daniel rushed upstairs, his tie undone, panic in his eyes. He lifted the baby, whispering, "Daddy's here. Ethan, please." But the child wouldn't stop. His tiny fists hit the air, his face red and desperate. Hours passed. The cries echoed, relentless. Daniel sat by the crib, helpless, haunted by the memory of that quiet night when Isabella had held him. The only time Ethan had truly been at peace. He pressed his palms over his face, his body trembling. The house that once felt grand now felt like a prison filled with echoes of choices he couldn't undo. Outside, the rain didn't stop. It fell softly against the windows, like a lullaby for no one. Down in the dark street, miles away, Isabella found shelter under a worn awning, her clothes dripping, her body shivering. She clutched her small bag, staring into the night. Her heart still carried the rhythm of that baby's breathing, the warmth she'd lost, the ache she couldn't silence. And though she didn't know it yet, the thread that bound her to that mansion, to the man who had cast her out, to the child who still cried for her, had not been cut. It only stretched, thin and fragile, waiting for the day it would pull them all back together again. The night was long, heavy with silence that pressed against the walls of the Carter mansion. Ethan's cries had quieted only because exhaustion stole his voice. The house that once pulsed with life now sounded hollow, like a shell emptied of warmth. Daniel sat by the crib, his hands clasped together, his gaze lost in the fragile rise and fall of his son's chest. Outside, the rain drummed endlessly on the windows, each drop whispering the same word that had followed him since Isabella walked away. Mistake. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing. A father's duty, a man's reputation, a company's fragile balance. He had repeated these reasons to himself all day like a prayer, yet none could silence the ache in his chest. Each time he looked at Ethan's restless sleep, he saw Isabella's eyes full of tears, her trembling lips whispering, "Please, let me stay." But now she was gone, and the child he thought he was protecting had turned into a ghost of the baby he once knew. The following days blurred together. Daniel returned to work, but numbers swam before his eyes. The boardroom felt suffocating, the voices of his colleagues meaningless. Every evening, when he came home, the same scene awaited him. Ethan crying in his crib, Melissa trying to comfort him with mechanical patience. her eyes darting toward her phone more often than toward the child. On the third night, the pediatrician was called. Dr. Villanueva, a calm woman in her 50s, examined Ethan carefully before looking at Daniel with quiet concern. "He's not sick," she said. "Physically, he's fine. But emotionally, he's shutting down. Babies sense loss more deeply than people realize. Whoever he bonded with most, he's missing them." Daniel froze. Her words struck through the layers of pride and denial like lightning. He wanted to argue, to say it was impossible, but Ethan's tiny body trembled again, whimpering weakly. The sound was softer than before, not pain, but resignation. The doctor's voice lowered. "Find the person who made him feel safe, Mr. Carter, before it's too late." That night, Daniel couldn't stay in his office. He wandered the hallways, restless, every corner echoing memories of Isabella. He remembered her laughter when Ethan first smiled, the gentle hum she used to calm him, the way she never complained no matter how much work she had. He remembered the light in her eyes when she looked at his son, not as a duty but as love. The more he remembered, the heavier guilt became. Meanwhile, across the city, Isabella's life had turned into a quiet fight for survival. Her small savings were gone within 2 weeks. The boarding house owner, once polite, grew cold when she couldn't pay rent. "I'm sorry, Miss Torres, but I can't let you stay without payment," he said, voice firm but not unkind. She nodded, clutching her bag of folded clothes, dignity her last possession. Nights on the street were longer than any grief she had known. The city was cruel after dark. Cold wind through torn sleeves, footsteps of strangers who didn't see her, and the ache in her stomach that refused to quiet. Yet even in the emptiness, she found small lights. One evening, when the chill became unbearable, an old man offered her half of his bread. His beard was white, his jacket too thin, but his eyes were kind. "You look like someone who's forgotten how to rest," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I forgot how to be alive." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're still breathing, aren't you? That's enough to begin again." His name was Mr. Howard. He lived beneath a bridge with a handful of others who shared scraps of food and silent prayers. They called themselves the Quiet Ones, people who had nothing but still carried gentleness in their hands. Isabella joined them, sleeping on cardboard under the hollow sound of passing cars. Every morning, she woke before dawn, shivering, her body aching from the cold. Sometimes she found bottles to sell, sometimes nothing. But what hurt most wasn't hunger. It was the way her body still remembered being needed. Her breast still ached. Her heart still heard phantom cries in the wind. On one of those mornings, she whispered into the gray air, "Ethan, I hope you're warm." Her breath formed clouds that disappeared as quickly as hope itself. Back at the mansion, Daniel began to see the truth unravel. Melissa grew careless, leaving bottles unwashed, scrolling through her phone while Ethan whimpered in the crib. One afternoon, as Daniel entered the nursery quietly, he froze at the sight before him. Melissa speaking on the phone, laughter spilling carelessly from her lips, while Ethan's tiny arms reached for her in vain. "Melissa," he said sharply. She jumped, dropping her phone. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I was just leaving him alone?" His voice was low, dangerous. She stammered. "He's fine, sir. Babies cry. He'll stop." But he didn't stop. He cried harder, and Daniel's heart clenched. Without thinking, he lifted Ethan into his arms. The baby's sobs softened for a moment but did not cease. Daniel paced, whispering, "It's all right, little one. Daddy's here." But his voice trembled, and the child sensed it. He knew. Love without peace could not soothe. Later that evening, Daniel overheard Melissa on the phone again, whispering. The tone in her voice made his stomach twist. When he listened closer, the words became knives. "Yes, I sold the extra medication. He doesn't notice anything. Rich men never do." The next moment shattered whatever restraint Daniel had left. He burst through the door, eyes blazing. "You did what?" Melissa spun, her face draining of color. I was just stealing my son's medicine to sell?" His voice shook with fury. Tears filled her eyes. I needed money for my mother. I didn't mean. Enough! His voice roared through the room. Get out. As she stumbled for the door, her words slipped out like poison, desperate to wound before she was gone. You think I'm the problem? That made you fired was the real danger. She's obsessed with your child. Stop lying, he snapped. But Melissa laughed bitterly. Lying? I made it all up so you'd trust me. She was the only one who cared about that boy, and you threw her away. Her words hung in the air long after she was gone. Daniel stood frozen, the truth unfurling like a wound reopening. He sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. The house was silent again, except for the faint whimpering of his son. Hours later, he whispered into the dark. What have I done? Guilt burned like fever. He remembered the night Isabella had pleaded to stay. He remembered her soaked figure walking into the rain. He remembered the peace in Ethan's face when she held him. He couldn't stay still anymore. He grabbed his coat and car keys, his movements trembling. The city was vast, but he would search every street if he had to. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads glistening with reflections of streetlights. He drove through narrow alleys, through neighborhoods he had never seen, stopping anyone who might know her name. Have you seen a young woman? Dark hair? Brown eyes? Name's Isabella Torres? But most just shook their heads. Some didn't even look up. He went to the old boarding house where she had stayed. The manager sighed. She left weeks ago. Couldn't pay rent. Poor girl. Didn't say where she was going. Churches, shelters, hospitals, no one knew her. Each rejection pressed harder on his heart until he could barely breathe. By the fourth night, Daniel's eyes were hollow, his voice raw from asking. He stopped his car near a dim park and sat in silence, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The city blurred behind tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He whispered, Please God, just let me find her. Somewhere beneath that same sky, Isabella sat under the bridge beside Mr. Howard, her thin shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She coughed softly, her body weak, but her eyes still gentle. You should rest, Howard murmured. You're fading. I'll be fine, she whispered. Someone out there still needs me. The next morning, Daniel's phone rang. A woman's voice came through, hesitant but urgent. Mr. Carter, I think I saw the woman you're looking for. Near the old Avenue Bridge. She looked very sick. He didn't wait. He drove through the morning fog, heart pounding like thunder. Under the bridge, he found her. A small figure curled up against the cold concrete, her face pale, lips cracked, hands trembling as though even breathing had become too heavy. Isabella, he called softly. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. Then her gaze sharpened with shock, pain, and disbelief. What are you doing here? Her voice was barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his heart breaking at the sight of her. Ethan's dying. He hasn't eaten in days. He needs you. She let out a faint, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. He needed me before. You sent me away. Daniel fell to his knees before her, rain seeping into his clothes. I was wrong. Please don't punish him for my mistake. I'll fix everything, just come back. Her eyes filled with tears. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, I'll go, but only for him. When he lifted her into his arms, she felt light, fragile, like glass. He carried her to the car as the wind whispered through the city, the same wind that had once carried her away, now carrying her home again. And in that silent drive back to the hospital, neither spoke. But the space between them was no longer filled with pride or blame. It was filled with something softer, the fragile beginning of forgiveness, and the faint promise that healing, though slow, had already begun. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and something heavier, the quiet ache of people waiting for miracles. Daniel carried Isabella through the glass doors as if she were something breakable, afraid the slightest jolt might make her disappear again. Her head rested weakly against his chest, her breath shallow. Nurses rushed forward when they saw him, recognizing the man whose name was printed on half the city's business towers. But at that moment, Daniel Carter was not a CEO, not a man of power. He was simply a father clinging to his last hope, and a man haunted by the woman he had wronged. "Room 206, a nurse said softly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The elevator doors opened with a faint chime, and he stepped inside, holding Isabella close as the world around them blurred into silence. She barely stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open once, and her cracked lips moved, whispering, "Is he alive?" "Yes," Daniel answered, his voice trembling. "But he's fading." When they entered the room, the sight struck her like lightning. Ethan lay small and pale against white sheets, his tiny body dwarfed by the machines beside him. Tubes ran from his hands. Oxygen whispered softly against his face. For a second, Isabella forgot how to breathe. Every step toward him felt like walking through water. She reached the bedside and touched his cheek with trembling fingers. His skin was cold. "Ethan," she whispered, and the sound of his name broke something open inside her. His eyes fluttered at the sound. As if somewhere deep in his fragile heart he recognized the voice that had once sung him to sleep. A faint whimper escaped him, a sound so weak and yet filled with longing that the entire room seemed to pause. Daniel stood frozen near the door, watching as Isabella leaned down, her tears falling onto the baby's blanket. "I'm here now," she said softly, her voice barely above breath. "It's okay, little one. You can rest." The baby stirred, his small hands twitching. The nurse beside them gasped quietly, whispering, "He's responding." Isabella gathered Ethan gently into her arms, pressing him close against her chest. She hummed softly, an old lullaby she didn't even know she remembered. Within seconds, the monitors steadied. His breathing slowed. The gray faded from his lips. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he watched the impossible unfold before him. The same woman he had cast into the streets was now cradling his child back into life. He stepped forward slowly, afraid that even his breath might disturb the fragile peace blooming in that room. For a long time, no one spoke. The doctor entered, astonished by the sudden change, whispering, "It's like he knew she was coming." But Isabella didn't hear. Her world had shrunk to the rhythm of Ethan's breathing, the warmth seeping back into his tiny body, the heartbeat against her own. She closed her eyes, feeling life return not only to him, but to the hollow place inside her that had died months ago. Daniel stood beside her, his hand hovering uncertainly above her shoulder before finally resting there. His voice came low, cracked with emotion. "Thank you for coming back." Isabella didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the child. "I came for him," she said quietly. But even as she spoke, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder sent a tremor through her. Days passed, slow and golden. Every morning, Daniel arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Every night, he left only when Isabella had fallen asleep beside Ethan's bed. He watched her with quiet awe, the way she sang softly to the baby, how her hands moved with grace even when she was too tired to stand. There was something sacred about her presence, something that healed without words. One afternoon, Daniel found her by the window, sunlight touching her face. "You haven't eaten all day," he said gently, holding out a cup of soup. She hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she murmured. Their fingers brushed, and for a heartbeat, the air felt heavy with something unnamed, fragile, but alive. He sat down beside her, staring out at the city. "When Claire died, I thought love had ended for me," he said softly. "But watching you with him, I realized love doesn't die. It just hides, waiting for courage to find it again." Isabella's eyes filled with quiet sadness. "Love cost me everything once," she whispered. "My child, my home, my name. I'm afraid to let it in again." He turned toward her, his voice gentle but certain. "Then let it heal you, not hurt you." For the first time, she looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the cold man who had fired her, but someone who was learning how to feel again. There were lines of regret etched deep in his face, but behind them lived sincerity. As the sun dipped lower, its golden light spilling across their hands, Daniel whispered, "You saved my son, Isabella, but you also saved me. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned her gaze back to Ethan, sleeping peacefully between them. His tiny breaths filled the space like a lullaby, a bridge between two hearts that didn't yet dare to meet. The following week, Daniel held a press conference at the hospital. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured. Standing before them, his voice firm but raw, he spoke the truth the city had twisted. Isabella Torres saved my son's life, he said. Every rumor you've heard about her is false. She is the reason my child is alive today. The story spread quickly, but this time not as gossip as grace. Neighbors who once judged her lowered their eyes when they saw her. The city that had cast her out now whispered her name with shame and admiration. Isabella, however, didn't celebrate. She stayed by Ethan's side, quiet, gentle, content to let healing happen in silence. Forgiveness, she knew, didn't need applause. It only needed peace. At night, Daniel often found her asleep beside the crib, her hand resting on Ethan's blanket. Once, unable to help himself, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. The small smile that curved her lips filled his chest with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Each day blurred into another, marked only by the rhythm of breathing, the soft hum of life returning. Ethan began to smile again. The doctors said it was a miracle. Daniel thought it was love. When the hospital finally discharged Ethan, Daniel insisted Isabella come home with them. Not as an employee, he said softly, but as family. She hesitated. I don't belong in your world. He smiled faintly. You belong where you're needed. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, but not heavy. For the first time, the silence between them felt warm. As they crossed the familiar gates, Isabella's heart fluttered, memories of pain, shame, and fear rising and fading like ghosts. But this time, she was not entering as the broken maid. She was entering as someone whose presence had brought life back into this house. Ethan cooed softly in her arms as they stepped through the door. The maids greeted them with awkward smiles, their eyes lowered with apology. Isabella said nothing. Forgiveness came easier when her heart was too full to hold anger. Days passed in gentle rhythm. The mansion no longer echoed with loneliness. Daniel spent his mornings with Ethan, his evenings sharing quiet moments with Isabella. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, and yet every silence carried meaning. One night, when the world outside slept, Isabella stood by the nursery window, watching the stars. The reflection of Daniel appeared beside her. He handed her a small cup of tea. Do you ever miss him? He asked softly. She knew what he meant. Her own child, the one she lost. Every day, she whispered. But when I hold Ethan, I feel like God gave me a second chance. Not to replace my son, but to remember love without breaking. Daniel's eyes softened. And maybe he gave me a second chance through you. The words lingered in the air, fragile but true. She felt tears welling up, not from sadness, but from something gentler, release. When Ethan stirred, Isabella turned and lifted him from his crib. Daniel watched her, his chest tightening with quiet admiration. There was something luminous in the way she held the child, something divine in its simplicity. He realized then that love didn't always arrive with thunder or passion. Sometimes it came softly, through forgiveness, through care, through the steady heartbeat of a woman who had suffered yet still chose kindness. That night, as Ethan drifted back to sleep between them, Daniel whispered a prayer of gratitude. For his son, for redemption, and for the fragile, growing love that now filled the spaces where grief once lived. Outside, the night wind brushed gently through the open window, carrying the scent of rain and renewal. The mansion no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a home, warm, forgiving, alive again. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew something was changing. Healing had begun its quiet work, weaving two broken hearts together with the softest thread, one that no rumor, no distance, and no shadow of the past could tear apart. Autumn came quietly to the Carter estate. The once harsh winds softened, and the trees outside the nursery window began to shed their golden leaves. covering the garden like a warm quilt. The house no longer felt like a hollow monument of grief. It had begun to breathe again, slower, steadier, as if rediscovering the rhythm of life. Every morning, sunlight slipped through the lace curtains and painted soft halos on the floor. Isabella would wake early, her footsteps light, her movements tender. Ethan's laughter, small, pure, and bright, had become the melody of every dawn. She would lift him into her arms, his tiny fingers tugging at her hair, his giggles spilling into her chest like sunlight into an old room. Daniel often watched from the doorway. He said little, but his eyes held the quiet astonishment of a man who couldn't believe how something as small as a child's smile could rebuild what tragedy had destroyed. He had changed. The stiffness that once defined him was fading. He was no longer the man chained to his desk or trapped behind grief's glass walls. When he spoke to Isabella now, his voice carried warmth instead of authority. One evening, while she rocked Ethan by the fire, Daniel entered the room holding a photo album. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I haven't opened this since Claire died," he murmured, brushing the dust from its leather cover. Inside were pages of frozen memories. Wedding photos, hospital smiles, moments that once hurt too much to remember. Isabella glanced at the pictures, her heart tightening. "She was beautiful," she said softly. He nodded. "She was kind, too. But after she passed, I locked everything away. I thought if I buried the memories, the pain would fade. Didn't. It just turned into silence." She looked at him, her eyes warm but steady. Sometimes silence is where pain learns how to speak again. Daniel turned to her, surprised by the gentleness of her words. "And you? How do you carry so much pain and still find room for love?" Her gaze lowered to the sleeping child in her arms. "I stopped asking why things broke. I just started thanking life for the pieces that still fit." Something in him softened completely. He reached out without thinking, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She froze, their eyes meeting. The firelight flickered across his features. Not the hard lines of a businessman, but the vulnerability of a man rediscovering his heart. For a moment the world felt still. Not even the crackle of the fire dared to intrude. Then Ethan stirred, breaking the spell. Isabella smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. Daniel withdrew his hand, his heart unsteady. That night, long after she had gone to her room, he sat alone by the dying fire. His thoughts drifted between the woman upstairs and the life he had nearly lost. Not just his son, but the part of himself capable of love. The embers glowed softly, mirroring the warmth quietly growing inside him. In the days that followed, the closeness between them deepened, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, healing rhythm of shared moments. Isabella began helping Daniel with small household matters, choosing Ethan's clothes, arranging flowers in the hall, sometimes sitting across from him during breakfast. They rarely spoke of the past, yet it lingered gently between them, not as a wound, but as something that bound them in silent understanding. One afternoon, rain began to fall. A light, steady drizzle that blurred the garden into shades of silver. Daniel stood by the window, watching the drops gather and slide down the glass. "Claire used to love the rain," he said, almost to himself. Isabella, standing nearby with Ethan in her arms, smiled softly. "Maybe she sent it to remind you that love doesn't end, it just changes form." Her words lingered in the air, filling the room with quiet peace. Daniel turned toward her, his gaze holding gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. "You always know what to say," he whispered. "I only say what I wish someone had told me," she replied, her voice a breath above silence. That night, Ethan fell asleep early. Isabella stepped out into the garden, drawn by the sound of rain against the leaves. The scent of wet earth filled her lungs. For the first time in months, she felt completely alive. No fear, no guilt, just the quiet rhythm of being. She tilted her face to the sky, letting the drops fall freely on her skin, as if each one was a blessing. Daniel found her there, standing barefoot on the damp stones, her dress clinging to her like the night's own breath. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her, the woman who had walked through pain and still found beauty in a storm. "You'll catch a cold," he said finally, his voice soft but thick with concern. She turned, smiling faintly. "Maybe I needed the rain to remind me I'm still here." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You're more here than anyone I've ever known." She looked away, her heart pounding. "Daniel." But he stopped her with a quiet shake of his head. "Don't say anything. Just stay." They stood in silence, rain whispering around them, two souls washed clean by the same storm. From that night on, something unspoken existed between them. A thread of warmth that neither dared to name, but both felt in every glance, every shared breath. As weeks passed, the bond between them grew. Daniel began bringing her coffee in the mornings, always the way she liked it, with honey instead of sugar. She started leaving small notes on his desk, gentle reminders to eat, to rest, to smile. Sometimes, late at night, she would find him asleep in the nursery, his head resting beside Ethan's crib. She would cover him with a blanket, her fingers lingering a little too long on his shoulder before retreating. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the windows, Daniel found Isabella asleep on the sofa, Ethan curled against her chest. He stood for a long time just watching them. The peace on her face, the small, trusting weight of the child between them. In that moment, he understood something he had been afraid to admit. She had become the heart of his home. But love, no matter how gentle, carries its own fear. Daniel wrestled with it quietly, afraid to ruin what had grown so naturally. He didn't know if she could ever forgive him enough to love him. He didn't know if he deserved it. One evening, he found the courage to speak. "Isabella," he began, standing by the doorway as she tucked Ethan into bed. "I've spent most of my life trying to build things that would last. Buildings, companies, legacies. But nothing I built ever gave me peace. Then you came, and suddenly everything I wanted felt simple. Quiet morning. A laugh. My son's smile." She turned, her heart trembling. "Daniel, don't say things you'll regret later." "I won't," he said, stepping closer. "I've regretted enough already. Let me be honest for once." He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "You've given me back more than I deserve. My son, my faith, my heart. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise truth. Stay, Isabella. Not because you're needed, but because you're wanted." Her eyes glistened. "I don't know how to love without losing," she whispered. "Then let's learn together," he said softly. The silence that followed was tender and fragile. She didn't answer, but the way her hand stayed in his said enough. That night, she sat awake long after everyone had gone to sleep, watching the moonlight spill across the floor. For the first time, the ache in her heart didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like room. Room for something new, something gentle, something that didn't erase the past but honored it. When she closed her eyes, she dreamed not of the child she lost, but of the life she was beginning to find. And as dawn came, painting the sky in soft pink light, the house was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a home filled with second chances, the kind of love that didn't rush, didn't demand, but simply healed. The wind outside carried the scent of morning rain, and somewhere deep inside, Isabella finally believed what Daniel had once said. Love doesn't die. It waits, quietly, patiently, until hearts are brave enough to open again. Winter came softly that year, the kind of cold that didn't bite but lingered, touching everything with quiet stillness. The Carter mansion, once haunted by sorrow, now glowed from within, firelight flickering against the windows, the faint hum of lullabies drifting down the hall. Inside, life had found a way to bloom again. Yet beneath the warmth, something fragile trembled, an emotion neither of them dared to name. Daniel had changed in ways even he didn't fully understand. The man who once measured his worth in contracts and quarterly reports now spent his mornings on the nursery floor, helping Ethan build towers of wooden blocks that always ended in laughter and collapse. And each time the little boy's laughter filled the air, Daniel's eyes would find Isabella, her smile soft, her gaze lowered as if afraid to be caught feeling too much. Their lives had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. She moved through the house with gentle grace, her presence turning every corner tender. There was no tension now, only a quiet awareness. The brush of hands when she passed him the morning paper, the lingering glance when their eyes met over dinner, the way silence between them had grown comfortable, almost intimate. One evening, snow began to fall outside, slow and delicate. Daniel stood by the window, watching the flakes gather on the branches. "It's strange," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "How peace can feel so new after years of noise." Isabella turned from the hearth, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Peace isn't new," she said softly. "It was always waiting. You just had to stop running long enough to feel it." Her words sank deep into him. He turned to face her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to look at her not as the woman who had saved his son, but as the woman who had unknowingly saved him too. She had given him silence without emptiness, forgiveness without demand, and love without expectation. He wanted to tell her all of this, that she was the first thing he thought of in the morning, the last before he slept, that every moment she smiled felt like sunlight warming a house long left cold. But he said nothing. Words felt too small for what she had become to him. Later that night, after Ethan had drifted to sleep, Isabella walked through the quiet halls. She paused outside Daniel's office, hearing the faint scratch of a pen against paper. She knocked softly. "Come in," his voice called, gentle as always. He looked up when she entered. The fire behind him painted his silhouette in gold. "You're still awake," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "It's snowing." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's a night for remembering." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Do you ever think of her?" He knew who she meant. "Every day," he said. "But it doesn't hurt the same anymore. I think she'd want it that way." Isabella nodded. "I think she'd be proud of the father you've become." Daniel's voice softened. "And what about you? Do you ever think of him, your son?" Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Every night," she whispered. "But sometimes, when Ethan laughs in his sleep, it feels like my boy is laughing with him. Maybe souls find each other again in different ways." He felt his throat tighten. "You've given my son more love than I could ever repay." "You don't have to repay love," she said quietly. "You just have to let it stay." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither moved. The air between them felt fragile, alive, trembling with words unsaid. Then Daniel stood, his steps slow as he crossed the room. When he stopped before her, she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Isabella," he said softly, her name like a confession. "You make this house feel alive again." Her heart pounded. "It's your home," she whispered. "It wasn't," he said, "until you came back." Something inside her broke open. A dam she had built to protect herself from hope. Tears welled in her eyes, not of pain but of release. "Don't say things you'll regret," she murmured. He shook his head. "I've lived too long with regret. I want to speak truth now." His hand rose hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away. The touch was tender, reverent, like he was afraid she might fade if he held her too tightly. "I thought I understood love once," he whispered. "But what I had before was certainty, not love. What I feel now, it's gentler, quieter. It's the kind of love that heals instead of burns." Isabella's lips trembled. "And what if it's too late?" He smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. "Love doesn't follow time. It waits for courage." Her breath caught, and for the first time in years, she let herself hope. She closed her eyes, and when his forehead touched hers, the world fell away. No walls, no past, only the warmth of two broken souls finding each other in the ruins of what once was. When they parted, no words followed. There was no need. The silence said everything, that forgiveness had been given, that love had quietly taken root, that neither of them was alone anymore. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the world in pale gold. Ethan's laughter echoed from the hallway, and Isabella turned, smiling as Daniel lifted the boy high into the air. "You see that smile?" he said to her, his voice soft. That's what you brought back to this house. She blushed, looking away. He brings it out of everyone. No, Daniel said gently, his eyes never leaving hers. You do. In the days that followed, their closeness deepened, woven through small moments. Her hand brushing his as they set the table. His coat draped over her shoulders when she forgot hers. The way he always waited for her to join them before eating dinner. These gestures carried more meaning than grand declarations ever could. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would stand in the doorway of the nursery, watching Isabella asleep beside Ethan's crib. The sight filled him with a quiet peace that felt almost sacred. He thought of all the nights he had prayed for salvation, never realizing it would come to him in such humble form. Not through miracles or wealth, but through love that arrived gently, wrapped in grace. Winter melted slowly into spring. The snow outside the mansion gave way to soft green grass and the laughter of a child running through the garden. Ethan's first steps came one bright afternoon. Wobbly, unsteady, but filled with joy. Isabella's laughter rang out like music as Daniel knelt beside them, arms open, his heart full in a way it had never been before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel found her sitting on the back porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. You've changed everything, he said quietly, taking a seat beside her. She smiled without looking at him. No, Daniel, you just remembered who you were before the pain. He looked at her then, really looked, the woman who had endured so much yet still glowed from within. You make me believe that maybe life isn't about what we lose, but about who helps us remember how to love after we've lost. Her gaze softened. And you make me believe love can be safe again. The air between them grew still, filled only with the scent of blooming roses and the distant sound of Ethan's laughter echoing across the yard. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing hers. This time she didn't hesitate. Her hand met his halfway, fitting perfectly, as if all the pain they had lived through had been preparing them for this. A love born not from perfection, but from the courage to begin again. They sat there as twilight deepened, saying nothing, because some moments didn't need words. The stars began to appear, one by one, scattered across the velvet sky. Daniel looked at her, and something quiet and certain bloomed inside him. He didn't need promises. He only needed this. Her presence, her breath, her warmth beside him. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he exhaled softly, a sound that felt like peace. And in that still evening, surrounded by the echoes of healing and new beginnings, both of them understood that love, once broken, doesn't always vanish. Sometimes, it returns softer, wiser, carrying with it the power to make everything whole again. The house was no longer a monument to loss. It was a home, alive with laughter and the scent of forgiveness. And in the quiet heartbeat between one moment and the next, Daniel and Isabella, two souls scarred by grief yet redeemed by love, finally found the peace they had been searching for all along. The days unfolded gently, one after another, like the soft turning of pages in a story neither of them wanted to end. Spring had painted everything in new colors. The air smelled of life, the garden shimmered with dew each morning, and the mansion that once echoed with sorrow now hummed with quiet laughter. Ethan's tiny footsteps had become music in every hallway. Wherever he wandered, joy followed, as if he carried sunlight in his small hands. Isabella often watched him play from the veranda, her heart swelling with gratitude she didn't know how to name. Every sound, every smile, every breath of that child felt like a prayer answered. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear her own lost baby's cry somewhere deep inside her. Not in pain anymore, but as a memory that had learned how to rest. Healing, she realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering without breaking. Daniel had become different, too. The weight he carried for years seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet steadiness that made him look younger somehow. He still worked, but not like before. He no longer chased success as if it could save him. In its place, he found something richer. Mornings spent with his son on his lap, evenings talking with Isabella about the simplest things. The weather, the flowers in bloom, the way Ethan's laughter could erase a long day's weariness. One morning, she found him sitting under the oak tree with Ethan perched on his knee, both of them watching a butterfly fluttering around. Daniel looked up and smiled at her. A smile that reached his eyes, warm, unguarded, the kind of smile that comes from peace. "Do you know what I used to think happiness looked like?" he said when she sat beside him. "It was always something distant, a dream I could never touch. But now it's this, just this." She looked at him quietly, sunlight brushing across his face. "Sometimes happiness isn't found," she said softly. "Sometimes it grows, like a flower that needed both rain and light." He glanced at her, and for a moment, their eyes held. The air between them felt charged but calm, like the moment before a confession that had been waiting too long. He wanted to tell her how much she had changed him, how her quiet strength had taught him to breathe again. But instead, he reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. From that moment, their lives began to intertwine in ways that felt effortless. Not rushed, not spoken, simply known. Daniel no longer hid his admiration. He showed it in the way he looked at her when she wasn't watching, the way he always waited for her laughter as if it were the proof that everything was all right. Every evening, the three of them would sit together by the garden fire pit. The air would be cool, filled with the sound of crickets and Ethan's sleepy hums. Sometimes, Daniel read stories aloud while Isabella leaned back, eyes half closed, her head resting against the chair as though every word was a lullaby. She had learned to smile again without fear. There was no longer the heavy shadow of her past pressing down on her. Instead, she carried it gently, like something fragile but no longer painful. Daniel noticed it, the way her eyes had begun to glow when she looked at life, as if she finally believed she belonged in it again. One afternoon, while folding Ethan's tiny clothes, Isabella found a small note tucked under one of his blankets. The handwriting was familiar, careful, deliberate. Daniel's. It said only, "You brought color back to this house, to my life, to my heart." Her fingers trembled as she read it, a soft ache blooming in her chest. She didn't confront him about it, but that night, when they crossed paths in the hallway, she smiled in a way that told him she had read his words and forgiven him for loving her too quietly. Days slipped into weeks. The bond between them deepened like roots beneath the soil, unseen but strong. They began to move as though they had always belonged side by side, sharing coffee in the early morning, watching Ethan's first attempts at speech, walking together after dinner while the child slept. There were moments that felt almost like confessions, though no words were needed. A glance that lingered too long, a laugh that came too easily, the soft brush of hands that neither pretended to withdraw from anymore. Still, some part of Isabella hesitated. Late at night, she would sit by her window and watch the moonlight touch the quiet streets below. In her heart, a question lingered, whether she was worthy of this peace, this love, whether she deserved to rebuild a life when so much had been lost. Daniel understood without asking. One evening, when he found her standing there again, silent and lost in thought, he stepped beside her. "You're allowed to be happy, Isabella," he said quietly. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself for surviving." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "It's hard to let go of pain. It feels like the last thing tying me to the ones I lost." He nodded slowly. "Then don't let go of it. Let it soften you instead." His words settled over her like warm rain. She breathed deeply, and for the first time, the weight in her chest loosened. The next morning, the world seemed brighter. The air carried the scent of jasmine, and even the light felt gentler. As she prepared breakfast, Ethan toddled into the kitchen, his tiny steps uneven but determined. "Mama," he said suddenly, clear and sweet. The word struck her like lightning. She froze, tears flooding her eyes. Daniel, who stood nearby, felt his heart twist. Isabella knelt, pulling Ethan into her arms, pressing kisses to his hair as her shoulders shook. Daniel stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knows who you are." She looked up at him, her tears shimmering in the morning light. "He doesn't know what that word means yet." "He doesn't have to," Daniel said softly. "He feels it." That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, they sat together in the garden once more. The stars shone like scattered promises across the velvet sky. Daniel turned to her, his voice steady but filled with tenderness. You know, when Claire died, I thought God had taken everything from me. But now I think maybe he was waiting to give me something different. Not to replace what I lost, but to show me that love can exist even after loss. Isabella's voice was quiet, trembling. I used to think love was a wound that never healed. Now I think it's the medicine that saves us. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and awe. Then maybe we were meant to meet, not as punishment, but as proof that even broken things can still become beautiful again. Their eyes met, and something shifted. The quiet certainty of two hearts that had been circling each other finally finding home. He reached for her hand, this time not tentative, but sure. She didn't look away. In that stillness, surrounded by moonlight and the scent of blooming roses, Daniel leaned in slowly, his forehead resting against hers. Neither moved for a long while. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't desperate or rushed. It was soft, steady, full of everything they had endured and everything they still hoped to become. When they parted, Isabella closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness but from peace. I never thought I'd feel this again, she whispered. Daniel brushed his thumb over her skin. You were never meant to stop feeling, he said. You were only waiting to feel safe again. They sat there until the night grew deep, their hands intertwined, their hearts steady. Healing had brought them together, slow, patient, real. And as the stars shimmered above them, the house behind them stood not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a promise of everything they had rebuilt. A place no longer haunted by grief, but filled with the quiet, endless echo of love's return. It was not the kind of love written in stories of grand gestures or burning passion. It was something gentler, wiser. A love that held instead of demanded, that healed instead of hurt. The kind that grows only after loss, when two people finally realize that what was broken was never meant to destroy them, but to teach them how to cherish what remains. In that gentle night, wrapped in the warmth of forgiveness and new beginnings, Isabella leaned against Daniel's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." He smiled, his voice a breath against her hair. "No, Isabella. You were the one who taught me how to be found." And with that, the silence around them turned soft, the sound of hearts finally at peace, the kind of silence that heals, the kind that feels like home. Morning came with a tenderness that felt like a blessing. The light poured through the tall windows in soft gold ribbons, brushing gently across the room as if it, too, wanted to say thank you for the peace that had finally returned. The air smelled faintly of roses and warm bread, and somewhere down the hall, Ethan's laughter rang out like the first song of spring. Isabella opened her eyes slowly, her heart already full before her mind could catch up. She lay for a moment just listening, to the distant giggles, to the faint clatter of dishes, to the quiet breathing of a house alive again. There had been a time when she thought mornings like this would never come, when the idea of peace felt like a dream she wasn't allowed to have. But now everything had changed. Love had changed it. Quietly, steadily, like dawn washing away the night. She slipped out of bed, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the nursery. The door was half open, and she paused to watch. Daniel was there, sitting on the floor with Ethan in his lap, holding a small wooden horse. The boy was squealing with joy, trying to grab it with his tiny hands while Daniel pretended to hide it, laughing softly. The sound was low and rich, full of warmth. A sound she had never heard from him before the world between them broke and healed again. For a moment she didn't move. She wanted to remember this exactly as it was. The sunlight across the carpet, the smell of baby powder, the way Daniel's eyes glowed when he looked at their son. Their son. The thought came to her gently, without guilt this time. Ethan had given her heart a home again, and Daniel had given her soul a reason to stay. When he looked up and saw her, his smile deepened. "You're awake," he said softly, like a secret. "I didn't want to interrupt," she whispered, stepping closer. "You're never an interruption," he replied, lifting Ethan toward her. You're the reason this morning feels whole. She took the baby into her arms, kissing his cheek as he laughed, and Daniel watched her the way a man watches a sunrise he never expected to see again. Slowly, reverently, afraid that blinking might make it vanish. Breakfast was simple, but every moment shimmered with quiet joy. Ethan sat between them in his high chair, smearing jam across his face while Daniel laughed and Isabella pretended to scold him. The sound of their laughter filled the room like soft music. Afterward, Daniel suggested a walk. The garden had blossomed again, full of color and fragrance. The world outside their walls was still turning, still imperfect, but here, among the tulips and ivy, it felt untouched by sorrow. They walked slowly, Ethan toddling between them, his little hands gripping their fingers. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promises good weather and better days. Birds sang above them, darting between the branches. Isabella breathed deeply, feeling life stretch gently through her chest. Do you ever think about how far we've come? Daniel asked, his voice low, as though afraid to disturb the peace. She smiled faintly. Every day feels like a different lifetime. He nodded. Maybe that's what love does. It gives you more than one lifetime inside the same heart. She glanced at him, her hand tightening in his. Then I think this is the life I was meant for. He stopped walking, turning toward her fully. You saved us both, Isabella. I can't ever repay you for that. Her eyes softened. Don't repay it. Just live it. That's enough. The wind moved gently through her hair as she said it, and Daniel reached out, brushing a strand away from her face. His touch lingered, his eyes searching hers with quiet awe. You know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I look at you and wonder if all the pain was just so I could find this moment. Tears stung her eyes, but they didn't fall. Then we both paid the price of love, she said softly. And love paid us back with peace. They continued walking, their hands intertwined, their steps matching perfectly. Ethan ran ahead to chase a butterfly, his laughter carrying through the air like sunlight turned into sound. For the first time, neither of them worried about tomorrow. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to look forward to. That evening, as the sky turned to gold and pink, they spread a blanket in the garden and watched Ethan play. The light wrapped around them, warm and forgiving. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, glancing at Isabella beside him. You ever wonder, he said, what people will think if they see us like this? She turned to him, smiling. Let them think what they want. We've lived through worse. He laughed quietly, that deep, tender laugh she had come to love. You're braver than anyone I've ever known. She rested her head on his shoulder. I'm not brave. I just stopped being afraid to love again. They sat like that until the first stars appeared, small and distant but clear. The world was still imperfect, still full of its quiet trials. But here, in this small corner of it, there was peace. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, they stood together by his crib. The moonlight poured in through the window, silver and still. Daniel slipped his arm around her, his hand resting gently against her back. He's dreaming, Isabella whispered, smiling. About what, do you think? Daniel asked. About love, she said softly. Because that's all he's ever known. Daniel looked down at her, his voice trembling slightly. I love you, Isabella. Her heart swelled, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, with tears glistening in her eyes, she whispered, I love you too, not for what you've given me, but for what you've healed. He pulled her closer, and they stood there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet, in the warmth, in the unspoken promise of everything yet to come. Outside, the night stretched endless and kind, carrying their silence like a prayer. In the days that followed, peace became their constant companion. Love no longer felt like something fragile they needed to protect. It had grown strong, rooted deep in forgiveness, watered by patience, blooming with every shared breath. And though the scars of their pasts would always remain, they no longer hurt. They had become reminders instead of everything they survived, of everything they built, of everything they finally learned to cherish. Sometimes, when Isabella stood by the window and looked at the garden bathed in morning light, she whispered a quiet thank you, to God, to fate, to the pain that once felt unbearable but had led her here. And in her heart, she felt a truth so simple and profound it could have been written into the stars. Love, when it is real, doesn't demand to be perfect. It only asks to be true. She turned, watching Daniel lift Ethan high into the air, both of them laughing, both of them whole. And she smiled, her heart blooming like spring after a long winter. If this story found a quiet place inside your heart, if it reminded you of something you've lost, or something you still hope to find, hold on to that warmth. Let it remind you that even after the darkest nights, love always finds its way back to the light. Leave a thought below, share what part touched your soul, or simply whisper your own story in the comments. And if you'd like to walk with me through more tales that heal, stories of second chances and hearts that learn to love again, stay, subscribe, and let's keep this little light alive together. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear what you've just felt. And maybe, through these words, they'll remember. No heart is ever too broken to love again. Morning came with a tenderness that felt like a blessing. The light poured through the tall windows in soft gold ribbons, brushing gently across the room as if it, too, wanted to say thank you for the peace that had finally returned. The air smelled faintly of roses and warm bread, and somewhere down the hall, Ethan's laughter rang out like the first song of spring. Isabella opened her eyes slowly, her heart already full before her mind could catch up. She lay for a moment just listening, to the distant giggles, to the faint clatter of dishes, to the quiet breathing of a house alive again. There had been a time when she thought mornings like this would never come, when the idea of peace felt like a dream she wasn't allowed to have. But now everything had changed. Love had changed it. Quietly, steadily, like dawn washing away the night. She slipped out of bed, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the nursery. The door was half open, and she paused to watch. Daniel was there, sitting on the floor with Ethan in his lap, holding a small wooden horse. The boy was squealing with joy, trying to grab it with his tiny hands while Daniel pretended to hide it, laughing softly. The sound was low and rich, full of warmth. A sound she had never heard from him before the world between them broke and healed again. For a moment she didn't move. She wanted to remember this exactly as it was. The sunlight across the carpet, the smell of baby powder, the way Daniel's eyes glowed when he looked at their son. Asterisk their son. Asterisk the thought came to her gently, without guilt this time. Ethan had given her heart a home again, and Daniel had given her soul a reason to stay. When he looked up and saw her, his smile deepened. "You're awake," he said softly, like a secret. "I didn't want to interrupt," she whispered, stepping closer. "You're never an interruption," he replied, lifting Ethan toward her. "You're the reason this morning feels whole." She took the baby into her arms, kissing his cheek as he laughed, and Daniel watched her the way a man watches a sunrise he never expected to see again. Slowly, reverently, afraid that blinking might make it vanish. Breakfast was simple, but every moment shimmered with quiet joy. Ethan sat between them in his high chair, smearing jam across his face while Daniel laughed and Isabella pretended to scold him. The sound of their laughter filled the room like soft music. Afterward, Daniel suggested a walk. The garden had blossomed again, full of color and fragrance. The world outside their walls was still turning, still imperfect, but here, among the tulips and ivy, it felt untouched by sorrow. They walked slowly, Ethan toddling between them, his little hands gripping their fingers. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promises good weather and better days. Birds sang above them, darting between the branches. Isabella breathed deeply, feeling life stretch gently through her chest. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Daniel asked, his voice low, as though afraid to disturb the peace. She smiled faintly. "Every day feels like a different lifetime." He nodded. "Maybe that's what love does. It gives you more than one lifetime inside the same heart." She glanced at him, her hand tightening in his. "Then I think this is the life I was meant for." He stopped walking, turning toward her fully. You saved us both, Isabella. I can't ever repay you for that. Her eyes softened. Don't repay it. Just live it. That's enough. The wind moved gently through her hair as she said it, and Daniel reached out, brushing a strand away from her face. His touch lingered, his eyes searching hers with quiet awe. You know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I look at you and wonder if all the pain was just so I could find this moment. Tears stung her eyes, but they didn't fall. Then we both paid the price of love, she said softly. And love paid us back with peace. They continued walking, their hands intertwined, their steps matching perfectly. Ethan ran ahead to chase a butterfly, his laughter carrying through the air like sunlight turned into sound. For the first time, neither of them worried about tomorrow. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to look forward to. That evening, as the sky turned to gold and pink, they spread a blanket in the garden and watched Ethan play. The light wrapped around them, warm and forgiving. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, glancing at Isabella beside him. You ever wonder, he said, what people will think if they see us like this? She turned to him, smiling. Let them think what they want. We've lived through worse. He laughed quietly, that deep, tender laugh she had come to love. You're braver than anyone I've ever known. She rested her head on his shoulder. I'm not brave. I just stopped being afraid to love again. They sat like that until the first stars appeared, small and distant but clear. The world was still imperfect, still full of its quiet trials. But here, in this small corner of it, there was peace. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, they stood together by his crib. The moonlight poured in through the window, silver and still. Daniel slipped his arm around her, his hand resting gently against her back. He's dreaming, Isabella whispered, smiling. About what, do you think? Daniel asked. About love, she said softly. Because that's all he's ever known. Daniel looked down at her, his voice trembling slightly. I love you, Isabella. Her heart swelled, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, with tears glistening in her eyes, she whispered, I love you too, not for what you've given me, but for what you've healed. He pulled her closer, and they stood there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet, in the warmth, in the unspoken promise of everything yet to come. Outside, the night stretched endless and kind, carrying their silence like a prayer. In the days that followed, peace became their constant companion. Love no longer felt like something fragile they needed to protect. It had grown strong, rooted deep in forgiveness, watered by patience, blooming with every shared breath. And though the scars of their pasts would always remain, they no longer hurt. They had become reminders instead of everything they survived, of everything they built, of everything they finally learned to cherish. Sometimes, when Isabella stood by the window and looked at the garden bathed in morning light, she whispered a quiet thank you, to God, to fate, to the pain that once felt unbearable but had led her here. And in her heart, she felt a truth so simple and profound it could have been written into the stars. Love, when it is real, doesn't demand to be perfect. It only asks to be true. She turned, watching Daniel lift Ethan high into the air, both of them laughing, both of them whole. And she smiled, her heart blooming like spring after a long winter. If this story found a quiet place inside your heart, if it reminded you of something you've lost, or something you still hope to find, hold on to that warmth. Let it remind you that even after the darkest nights, love always finds its way back to the light. Leave a thought below, share what part touched your soul, or simply whisper your own story in the comments. And if you'd like to walk with me through more tales that heal, stories of second chances and hearts that learn to love again, stay, subscribe, and let's keep this little light alive together. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear what you've just felt. And maybe, through these words, they'll remember. No heart is ever too broken to love again.